scenarios for different types of subscriptions. You know, these are license-based subscriptions, but they might have different providers, and that's what I wanted to review. So we're looking at this Exchange Online plan, and you'll see that the provider here is listed as Partner Center. What this means is that every time a quantity is changed for the subscription, it's going to be automatically provisioned by Partner Center, right? And you can see that in the change logs here. They were in awaiting provisioning status, and they've been updated automatically, and they've been provisioned in Partner Center, and they've been marked as provisioned in Work 365 as well. So it's important to note when you have an automatic provider like Partner Center, that process is a little bit different from a manual provider. Ismail, were you going to say something?
No, sorry, go ahead ahead, please, Sam.
Okay. Okay, so when you're in a bundle and say you're looking at a child subscription of that bundle, just another navigation tip, you can go from the child subscription of that bundle and click on the parent subscription, and it will take you back to the parent subscription. Okay, so now we're looking at the parent subscription again, and I want to show the scenario for let's see, a manual provider here, right? So this subscription, Sky Blue Managed Backup for Office 365, we have a license tied to the subscription, but there's no automatic provider in this case, which means it's going to be a manual provider, and we would have to manually provision the license for that subscription. So what this means is anytime you have a manual provider, this could be you know, a third-party vendor that you're working with. It could be a distributor that you're working with. It could be possibly even your own IP. If there's a license that needs to be physically provisioned, it would be a manual provider in that case, and you would have to physically provision the license. So the recommended workflow for a manual provider, whenever you change that quantity amount, and in this case, the quantity amount was adjusted on the parent subscription, but for this child product, the quantity is 6 again to match that parent. After the quantity has been changed, what that means is you would have to go into that provider portal or distributor portal, you know, wherever the provider is, physically provision the license on that side or on their end, and then come back into Work 365. And then what you'll do is change the provisioning status to provisioned. Just another kind of tip on Dynamics in general, if you have more than one changelog that needs to be edited, you can do that in bulk by, you'll see I opened up a grid here, and this grid will open up a pop-up, and I can select all of the changelogs at once, and I can edit them, and then automatically, or not automatically, but I can change the status to provisioned here, right? And then I'll mark it as changed, and it will update the changelogs as provisioned. So then we can close that, and you'll see when we go back into the subscription, you'll see that they have now been updated, and the system knows that this subscription has been provisioned, right? So that's the recommended workflow when you have a manual provider, going into that provider portal, physically provisioning the license on that side, coming back into Work 365 and updating the changelog from awaiting provisioning status to a provision status, so the system knows that the subscription has been provisioned. As well as, you know, people within the organization, they need to know that the subscription has been provisioned as well. Okay.
I'll just make one comment here, Samantha, on that manual provider and the do nothing provider, just so everybody understands why we call it manual provider and do nothing provider. It's basically, it's just what they represent technically in the system. All right. So ideally, what you want to be able to do in your environment is rename them to what makes sense for your business. So you probably don't want to call it a manual provider. You would go ahead and rename it to whatever that manual provisioning system is, or that provisioning system is, and not even have that name manual provider in there. Ideally, you'd say such and such distributor as the name, or whatever that system is, but you want to basically rename everything from the generic names that are there in the system to really how your users and your sales team and your service team is going to actually use that system for the purposes of provisioning. So typically you don't want to say, do nothing is probably okay to have, but manual, probably you want to change that, right? So if you really have a manual provider, you want to name it exactly as you know it in your day-to-day life and your business operations. So maybe we can look at that a little bit later, Samantha, if you go back into the providers whenever you're done.
Yep, will do. One last scenario to review, though. Just looking at, so we looked at, what a do-nothing provider is at a bundle level. When you have a bundle, there's no license to provision at that point for the parent subscription, so that's why it's a do-nothing or virtual provider. It's going to be the same typically whenever you have like a managed service, for example. So we'll just take a look at that here. So when you have a managed service, typically there is no license tied, what a do-nothing provider is and everything. When you have a subscription that's a managed service type of subscription that a lot of CSP partners will have as part of their business, that subscription typically does not have a license tied to it, right? So the provider in that case would also be a do-nothing provider because there's nothing to physically provision at that point. So then these change logs that are in awaiting provisioning status, they will be updated to a not applicable status as well. So that's the last scenario I wanted to review. So there's kind of two scenarios for do-nothing providers. First scenario, when you have a bundle and that parent subscription, there's nothing to provision at the parent level, so that has a do-nothing provider. And then also when you have a service-based subscription, like a support and migration subscription, for example, there's no license tied to it, so that's also a do-nothing provider because there's nothing to physically provision at that point. Okay.